If it's not fun, if an open source project isn't fun, and if it's not doing something that's like markedly different from what every other project is doing, then I think it's probably self-defeating and not likely to get a lot of maintainer time. So I really discovered open source as a way to connect with people in really odd kind of niche interests like mine. And that project grew into Autofac, which has been around for quite a long time in .NET now. And it's also maintained and has been extended by a lot of people after I've left that. Initially, I took a very ad hoc kind of approach to kind of inviting people into projects. But over time, I found there's a sort of a pattern where the people who kind of have to fix a bug, maybe deal with something that is blocking them will often kind of come by, make a few changes and then move on. The people who are really interested in the project for its own sake and maybe not just to sort of solve an immediate problem, they tend to come back and answer questions maybe more than once or submit more than one patch. So I've kind of got a rule of thumb now on the projects I work on where once people have made a couple of contributions to the code base, then they're automatically part of the maintaining kind of body for that project. So Serilog began as a kitchen sink kind of a project, and originally, to make it a viable project, we really had to supply everything that somebody could need to use it in any environment. The core of the idea that got Serilog launched, a much more event-focused framework that deals with structured data more than the traditional kind of text format that logs have been kind of historically bound to. But turning that into something that people could use in an enterprise setting meant building everything from the configuration system all the way through to different syncs for all the different kinds of log storage mechanisms people would have in enterprises. Nobody was going to come along and volunteer to do that work, and so we naturally took that into the Serilog organization to begin with. And then fast forward maybe 3 or 4 years, and suddenly we have dozens and dozens of sub-projects in all of these different technology areas. It's very difficult to find somebody who has the skills to work on, say, the Serilog console logging provider, as well as CouchDB, as well as MongoDB, as well as... So we reached a point a couple of years ago where we started to stop including any new work in the organization. We'd instead provide support for people through their GitHub projects or through Stack Overflow, and try and encourage people who needed a different component for Serilog to build that and maintain it themselves. That's been quite successful in that a lot of the popular pieces of the Serilog ecosystem now are not under the Serilog organizational umbrella. So initially, I think I was drawn to open source by the goals of the free software movement in a way. That there's a lot of value in kind of code that's for the public good, or that shared infrastructure that we all depend upon. I view the open source that we're mostly doing in the kind of NuGet.NET world as being for a different set of goals. And I don't know if they're not always mutually exclusive, but I think that there's a lot of joy in working on building your own tools. And I think that motivates a lot of the non-ideological kind of open source. So while I really admire and value a lot of projects that are aiming for software freedom, I think that day to day, the open source that I work on, most of us do, that really just comes from that desire to make our own tools better. And I think that libraries are kind of a special case of developer tooling, where if you do invest in them and you collaborate on them, then the whole experience of doing development in .NET becomes more enjoyable. So I don't think that those necessarily have to be kind of competing goals for open source, whether it's kind of free and for the public good, or whether it's just a matter of kind of expediency. And I definitely don't feel bad putting time into things that are not, I guess, humanitarian or philanthropic projects that way. One of the things I think that we all really like about the Microsoft ecosystem is that there's so much in the box, and there's so much kind of maintained, supported, documented code like that. The only other ecosystem that I have to kind of compare these days is the Rust world, which I spend a lot of time in through my work. And increasingly, I think, through interests in open source. And the approach that Rust has taken has been more to resist adding anything into the standard kind of library and force the kind of main components of Rust to be delivered by the ecosystem and the community. I think by doing that early, it really shaped people's expectations. So just like in Node projects, it's not really that surprising to start a Rust project and install 10 kind of community packages. And it's not really bloat in the sense in that you're not really getting any more code than if the Mozilla or the Rust team at Mozilla or Rust core team otherwise had built those things. But you kind of see where they come from a lot, and you accept, I think, a lot more diversity in kind of sources for code. If you've got an idea for an open source project and success for your idea, I guess, is that everybody's using your code, you're probably going to find yourself disappointed in a way, because once something becomes popular, it invites kind of not imitation so much as I think people absorb the ideas that are in it, and then they find other ways to express those ideas in different projects. So I learned through the Autofac project, a lot of the core ideas of Autofac that were kind of even controversial at the time, that the container should always hang on to resources to dispose them, the idea of scoped lifetimes, using lambdas to activate components. Those things are so run-of-the-mill in .NET IOC containers now that I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who could pinpoint those back to Autofac in the early days. And yet Autofac feels really successful to me because those ideas became prevalent. And Serilog as well. I think the fundamental goals of the early project are very much achieved now. That .NET has got a message template-based structured logging implementation. Nlog has also implemented the same style of structured logging, which came along a couple of years ago. If you really love the idea and it's worth implementing it so others can kind of learn that idea, open source is great. I think any other kind of goal where you really want the world to use your code is just destined for frustration, because you don't realize so much yourself that even, say, Serilog, so much of the intellectual kind of shape of Serilog comes from Log4j, which comes from Log4j, which comes from probably something that somebody spent nights and weekends on implementing in Fortran in 1978. So I had the experience of taking Autofac all the way through from being a completely new project to kind of it being totally mature and me disengaging from it. The eventual kind of payoff, I suppose, if you look at how I could find the time to work on Autofac for free, was that sometime around about well, I guess it became the end rapidly, but once Autofac had become popular, that opened the door to go and work on some other BCL components on the .NET team at Microsoft. So in a way, I worked on Autofac as a labor of love, and I think most of the people who worked on it were doing it for the same reasons. But I really learned that Autofac opened doors that way by connecting to people who were also interested in the same kinds of things. So I moved on from Autofac around about the time that I moved to the States and worked for Microsoft there. But in all, I think I considered open source sort of self-justifying from that experience. Serilog is a little different. I think that initially, from the very beginning as well, I was using Serilog in my day-to-day work as a consultant. Being able to just kind of show people the insides of their running systems without all of that kind of extra work that comes with, say, event sourcing or other forms of like event-based instrumentation. That was the payoff, I think, that made building Serilog in the beginning sustainable for me. Now Serilog is in part, I think, maintained by companies who are working in the same space, where, for example, the primary maintainer of the Splunk sync for Serilog works for Splunk, and the primary maintainers, I think, of the Elastic sync, actually a couple of the maintainers there are from the community, but we have people who work for Elastic who work on the Elastic sync. I started another project maybe 3 years after beginning Serilog that was backend for consuming and viewing logs, and so that, as it grew into a product that I work on day to day called Seek, has provided a lot of time for me to work on Serilog during the day as well. So I think long term, having a healthy kind of open source project does, at least in .NET, I think, requires companies to kind of take their part and move that forwards. I think it's worked well for Serilog for the most part.